Good afternoon. I'm Sylvia Carmen Cubina, Executive Director of the BAS, and I would like to give you all a warm welcome to the 9th Curator Culture Talk. Started in 2007, this series centers around creativity and expression and mashes up conversations between people of different disciplines and walks of life. 4 weeks ago, the BAS held its first all-digital post-COVID talk of this series. As we prepared for the talk, we decided to change the subtitle to "We Interrupt Our Regularly Scheduled World." 4 weeks ago, we adapted to a new world. And now, following weeks of sadness, unrest, and violence, and as we stand against racial injustice, there's even more of an urgency to interrupt our regularly scheduled world. Museums have an important role, and it's to create spaces for conversations, diverse voices, and the freedom to express ideas. Now more than ever, museums need to listen and listen some more. We need to open up these spaces wider than before, and museums need to take action and make changes that will contribute to a better world for everyone. And with this, as we prepare for an amazing conversation, I introduce our moderator, Tom Healy.
Thank you, Sylvia. And thanks everybody for joining us in these really tough days and times. You know, the extraordinary artist and filmmaker Carol Walker said that times like we're going through are ones that rip gaping holes in the fabric of what's normal. And she said, we patch those gaping holes with questions. The questions we said, what do I do? Where do I go? Do I look hard at things? Do I turn away? And then the biggest question she said we ask is, how is the world going to be different? How is the world going to be changed by this event? And she said her answer to that question is, which event? There are many events. Each one of us is an event. The question is too broad and too inadequate to talk about how will we be changed by this. But the issue is that we need to talk about it. We need to define it. We need to see all sides of the event and who's involved. And we believe that art helps us ask those kinds of questions. It helps us get by when the answers aren't easy or obvious. And so we're joined today by two extraordinary people who've been asking questions their whole life, creating interesting and compelling challenges to us. And we're thrilled to be having them join us, Pete Buttigieg and Billy Porter. Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks for being here.
You're very welcome.
Thrilled to be with you.
Thank you.
Honored to be with you.
Thanks. So Billy, you know, last fall you did cover of the Buffalo Springfield song For What It's Worth. And it seems so hit in the gut relevant right now. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look, what's going down?
Yes. Well, you know, I am first generation post-civil rights movement. I just turned 50 last fall. And so, you know, I grew up in an era where a thing called protest music was an actual genre that many artists participated in to speak truth to power out loud. I knew that I wanted to contribute this year coming, which what we're in right now in the election year. I knew it would be through my art in some way. And I chose this song because it's ubiquitous. It's kind of like an anthem from that time. Stephen Stills wrote it with Buffalo Springfield and continued on with Crosby, Stills and Nash. And you know, activism is in my DNA. I came out as gay in 1985, and we went straight to the front lines to fight for our lives. So it's all I know. And all I know how to do is show up and try to participate in this democratic experiment we're living through right now.
Thank you. So Pete, talk to us about that democratic experiment. You were been on the front lines of it. Well, pretty much all of your adult life, but right through a 0 to 100 miles an hour and then some in the last 2 years. How do you put in context what's happening right now in the time of our political adult lives?
Well, I think what's happening right now is telling us two things about politics, and they seem to contradict each other, but we need to fit them together. One thing it's telling us is that what's going on us as we stop and look around is bigger than politics and elections alone. It's a reminder that the outcomes and the decisions that happen in political office and in halls of power really follow what's happening socially. And what we have now, I think, is a reawakening or a different kind of consciousness taking place across the United States that will in turn propel politics and politicians to respond. And so I think it's important to recognize and honor, as has always been the case with major change in this country, that it begins often far from where power is held, in the streets, in art, in conversations, in homes, and then finds its way into influencing politics through elections. That's part one. But part two is we're seeing just how much politics matters. It matters that we have a president who is not capable of responding to the times, whether it is the outpouring of anguish over police violence and systemic racism that includes, but in so many ways, takes its measure far beyond the individual horrors like the killing of George Floyd or the killing of Breonna Taylor and the failure of the system to respond to that. But the entire complex of systemic racism is something that our president's obviously not prepared to acknowledge, let alone deal with, let alone bring the country together to confront. The same thing, of course, in a different way, visible in the failure of leadership when it comes to getting through this pandemic, which of course has such disparate impact on Americans of color and Americans of lower income. And so the life and death stakes of politics are being raised, I think, in a way that, look, when I was running for president 6 months ago, if you had come to me and said, you know, the stakes of this election are about to go up, I would have asked how that could possibly be the case, how they could possibly be any higher than they already were at the time that I stepped into the race, or the time that I stepped out of the race. And since then, we've seen just how much is at stake and been reminded why it matters who's in charge. Because at the end of the day, the protests that we see and honor are ultimately about making specific changes in specific institutional practices and arrangements around how power works in this country and specific policies that come down to what happens in the political sphere. So on one hand, we have a humbling of the political sphere because we see how this is much deeper and bigger than politics. This is about who we are as Americans and whether this country can be what it wants to think it is. And on the other hand, we see just how important politics is because either these policies are going to change or we're going to fail.
Bill, you've said that this thing about it being deeper than politics, you said that everybody knows the first way to change things is through the arts. And we all partly know it because it's the first thing to go. The politicians get afraid of it. Can you talk about that?
Sorry. It's historical for me as, you know, an artist who has trained in the ranks and come up. You know, it started with the Greeks, you know, Shakespeare. We are the mirror of what the culture is going through. We have a way of turning the mirror onto ourselves so that we can see ourselves clearer, so that we can see ourselves deeper and better and hopefully move towards something that's better than who we are in the present. And I really do feel like, Pete, talking about a humbling. I've never heard it quite that way before, and that is so perfect. A humbling. You know, I've been saying it very often, you know, the greatest country in the world to whom? Because if it's not for everyone, then we will fail. That's right. Rome fell. Let's not forget, Rome in its time was what America is today, or was before this bozo got into office. So, it's, the big banks are too big to fail. It's too big to fail. It's like, no, everything can fail. Everything can fail. And we must use this moment that we're in, this global reset that we're in, to really identify the fractures that are in the infrastructure of our system. We cannot forget that this country was built on the backs of people stolen from another one. This country was stolen from the people who were already here. This is not what they teach in history class on purpose. History is told by the winners. So it's like, it should not be surprising to anybody who's living on this earth that this reckoning is happening. The Constitution was written by white men who owned people. They owned people. It should be no surprise that the system is broken, but we can't heal from something until you admit that there's something that exists that's wrong. That's what the mirror is, and that's what artists do. You have to admit it. It's like, it's good. It's like, this is what happened. We can't act like slavery didn't happen. You know what I mean? It's like, it happened and this is the result of it. So how do we own it? How do we honor it? How do we, it's like I think about the Germans, and I think about how they've made it a felony to have swastikas and stuff. It's like, it's time. It's time to have those kinds of conversations.
Pete, what do you think about, I know you've studied South Africa and Nelson Mandela, to pick up on part of what Billy's saying in owning this and admitting it, looking hard in the mirror, they came up with the truth and reconciliation process. Is there something to a different way to have the conversation about race and the systemic injustice that began with owning people and slavery all the way up through now? What is a reset that's different?
I do think we're going to need to learn a lot from models like that Truth and Reconciliation Commission model. There's something somewhat like it was deployed in Cambodia to deal with the genocide. And I think part of the American self-image, of course, is we think that things like that apply to a completely different reality. And, war-torn countries don't sound like us, except, as Billy pointed out, there's no denying that that's very much like us. This is a country that has not come to terms with the enslavement of so many people that to this day, that's the other thing, this is not a quaint historical artifact. This is something that is with us today. Art gave us, literature gave us the vocabulary of Faulkner, who said that the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And here we are, a country that hasn't come to terms with its own past. And, I think the other reason we're going to need to think about models like that is the reality is so much of the change needs to take place among white people. And I don't just mean among avowedly racist white people. On the contrary, while that is an ugly problem when there's that kind of naked, self-conscious racism, we're dealing with a whole system that was built in such a way that many of the people who reproduce that system are not conscious of the ways that we are implicated. And it is not fair for this to only move at the pace of what white Americans can handle. But it is clear that it cannot simply be left as yet another burden on Black Americans standing up for the value of their own lives to do all the work. I think right now across the country, well-intentioned white people are reaching out to our Black friends to assign to them the work educating us on how we've got to change. And while on one hand, it is absolutely right that we are ensuring and acting to hear and amplify Black voices and Black leaders as much as possible, that does not mean that the work of change, the hard work of change, can fairly be outsourced only to those who are advocating things that, as one friend put it the other day, they've been screaming at the top of their lungs for generations. And so the reason I think we should not be afraid to learn from the models of other countries recovering from things as grave as war and genocide is that America is very much going to need to recover from those very same things that are no less grave and no less present, even if it's contrary to the image that we have of ourselves. And again, this is where art holds up, as Billy so eloquently put it, holds up that mirror that challenges us to see ourselves in a different way. And it can, that lens that lens can be paralyzing sometimes, but it can also be empowering. And if it might threaten to lead to guilt, it might also promise to lead to redemption.
Bill, you have an extraordinary personal story. I'll never forget seeing you for the first time at Joe's Pub. But what year was that when your show?
Oh, 2005, Ghetto Superstar.
Yeah. It seems like 100 years ago, but now you're a superstar. But then you're just, but part of what you sing and tell in that show is art coming through the window through the TV and other things. Can you talk a little bit about that first experience of getting transformed and feel like your life could change?
You talking about the Tony?
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to middle school in 1980. We were bused. It was the first time that I was sort of, spending my entire day with white people. There was an after-school program called Reisenstein Musical Theater. The school was called Reisenstein Musical Theater, and I went and I did the musical, and it was fun, and I was bit by the bug. And then that summer I was washing dishes and the Tony Awards came on, and it was the year of Dreamgirls. Jennifer Holliday came on the screen singing And I'm Telling You I'm Not Going. It really connected with me because it was the way I sang in church, which that was not, I did a Rodgers and Hart show called Babes in Arms. So it never even occurred to me that it was a way to make a living. But I think because I was seeing it on television, I thought, oh, wow, I could actually use this gift I've been given of singing and make a life for myself and dream beyond my circumstance. And, so that was the day it started, and I've never looked back.
Pete, you actually play the piano, and we've been all sheltered in place. What have you been playing?
Yeah, I've been maybe noodling better than is more accurate than playing, but I've been returning to Gershwin, who's an old friend, and just picking my way through whatever I can. I've had this long ambition of trying to. I only learned the idioms of written music, and I have this ambition of hoping to become more fluent in jazz, but I haven't quite got there yet. It's I think, and I'd be curious what your experience and what Billy's experience has been like. I always felt that if I were able to stay still or forced to stay still, I'd become much more creative, and I'd write and play music, and some of that's happened. But I actually think that in many ways there has been a kind of disorienting or paralyzing quality to the moment that's made it less likely to lead to creative moments than I thought it would. Maybe that's just me. I still find the piano a great, music a great friend and consolation, but I don't think that I've been able to summon a creative response to this yet, even in my kind of amateurish way, the way I often have used writing or music to kind of process what I'm going through. And I'm not sure if that's because we have fewer unexpected encounters with others in the COVID era, which is actually a huge creative stimulus in ways we may not even understand, or other reasons. But I wonder if your experience or Billy's experience is like that, or if you find that, some say that the plagues are great for creativity. It got us the Decameron, it got us King Lear. But I wonder how you feel about that.
Billy, what would you say?
I would say, excuse me, that at the beginning of this process, to slow down, to have a space, to just expand. We rented a house on Long Island. I have been very creative. I have also been so beaten down in the last couple of weeks that has slowed. So I would say it's been both. It has stirred something very creative in me, and I also, in some moments, feel quite paralyzed. Today is one of those moments.
I would say the same, I think, except, one of the things that's fascinating about art making is there's both that stereotypical solitude of an artist, but there's so much of art practice that's social in nature. Part of, as you were even saying, Billy, about protest songs. And there's a terrific artist named JR, a French artist who has often worked with communities. He did this extraordinary project in the favelas in Rio after there'd been some senseless police killings. And so he worked with the communities there, and they painted the eyes of women from that community on the fronts of the buildings that look down on the wealthier part of Rio. And so just this huge set of beautiful eyes. And it was a social project in the middle of that. And he felt his art is as much as the people making it with him as alone. And those kinds of things, which are often what happens with protest art, is where you can see this sort of moment. And sometimes it's about getting out of ourselves, which is a little, you get in that groove of being home in a pandemic, but it is about being out. So
go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Pete.
I noticed that part of how people are processing this moment also is a lot of comparisons to the 1960s. And part of it makes sense. There was racial anguish, there was upheaval, there was generational struggle. And of course, so many things are very different too. But I wonder whether we are prepared to mount the kind of creative response to, the 1960s, just the response to that moment gave us James Baldwin in literature, gave us, from James Baldwin to Bob Dylan, everybody was responding to and having an impact on the moment. And I wonder whether that analogy will fail us, or whether we might also expect this time a creative response to emerge that not only helps us make sense of the moment, but helps it actually lead to something better than just a return to some form of normal, whatever that means, when we wouldn't be here if normal was okay.
My first gut thing is, it's out there. There are, and you could talk about this too, Billy, such extraordinary artistic expression happening now, and it comes often out of a lot of personal pain and outrage, but also the joy of finding community, even in struggle. So we're not gonna lack for the great art of our time. I think the question is, are we going to have the shift of culture that our time needs? And whether, this very artist that I was talking about, JR, said, art creates a kind of energy, but it doesn't really make something happen. That's for politics and social action. But in a certain way, the fact that it doesn't is a good thing, because it gives this sort of space where we can reflect and look and get that mirror out, as Billy's saying, to force the social change. So art's going to be the mirror, not the change itself, I think.
But I think the mirror is the change.
Okay.
The mirror is what moves one to change.
Yeah.
If you don't have the mirror, then you're not like, you know, like you said earlier, Pete, it's like it's not just the white supremacists that need to look inward. It's the white liberals that need to look inward. Like that's what we've been saying all along, you know, and that's the hardest mirror. You know, we don't even, the others, we don't need that. It's the ones, our liberal right friends who are going, all lives matter, you guys. It's like, we have to have this conversation and you have to understand what this means because you all are our allies. And without a solid foundation together of unity, it's never going to move forward. We're never going to get any traction on this.
There was a really powerful piece in the Times the other day by a Black writer named Chad Sanders. And he was talking about, you know, he's trying to work, he's trying to write, he's trying to feed his family. And he's interrupted all the time by white people sending him love, hashtag love, heart emojis, we're with you. And we wrote, you know, white people are pushing me and others like me to alleviate their own guilt and prove they're different from everybody. It takes up a lot of space and a lot of emotional time. And he said, you know, what I feel all the time as a Black man is this lingering fear of death, and heart emojis and positive vibes are about you. They won't help. You have to do something different as a white ally. And that, I think, swings back to what you said, Pete, that means the burden of racism is on the white community, us to understand ourselves and what this is, to understand what whiteness is, all the things that privilege we take for granted.
Which again is very hard, especially for well-intentioned white liberals, because the only people we've seen really lean into an awareness of being white are the worst kinds of white nationalists. And we don't want to emulate them in any way. And at the same time, that's allowed us to be bathed in this, I think, implication that we don't have a race, right? So many, I think, educated white liberals are somewhat aware of the effect of race on the experience of being Black in America, but very much not aware of the effect of race on being white in America, right? There's two sides to that coin. Our lives are different in ways we are not required to notice. And that's part of the very same mechanical kind of working of this racialized existence is one that creates the kinds of pressures that are there. And I think there's going to be an awkwardness to this awakening. I certainly feel it. And there's going to have to be I think a releasing of this idea that only the worst kinds of people can be mixed up in systemic racism. Because the truth is that we are very much implicated, and again, there is a way to respond to that that can be constructive and uplifting. But I think groping our way towards it will inevitably be complicated and challenging. And again, one of those things that I think, and I say this as somebody who still believes fully in the power of political change, the importance of political change. If anybody wondered if it matters who's in what office, look no further than the things that have come out of the Oval Office in the last 3 or 4 weeks, not to mention local office, where so many decisions about everything from policing to housing are actually made. But having said that, I think the political vocabulary will be the last to catch up to the vocabularies that we need to develop through social action, through artistic expression, that'll help us come to terms with this. Because it's just too big for politics alone to handle.
Yeah. Well, could you were a mayor with a city with a large minority population, and there were lots of struggles with policing and poverty. Can you talk about some of that experience yourself of coming to that awareness of whiteness and structure of that, like in some personal way?
Yeah. Well, I think the first is to understand that the relationships of trust are just different, especially for Black residents who've experienced policing in the way that many or most Black Americans have. So a year ago, this week actually, for example, Eric Logan, a Black man, was killed by a police officer in South Bend. And the officer claimed that he was attacked with a knife, but his body camera was not activated. It was an example of a case where there was not a tidy set of facts to correspond to what so many residents wanted in terms of just sort of a clear and easy understanding of what happened. And so the way people viewed it really reflected on where they came from. And the idea that you would believe what the police officer had to say, since there was no footage to corroborate it, was a completely different thing to ask of a Black resident who maybe had a different experience of having been stopped or different stories in terms of what had happened to members of their community or neighborhood or family, than a white resident whose only experience with a police officer might have been being, a little bit annoyed with themselves when they got pulled over for speeding or running into somebody at a community event. And certainly for me, wrestling with that, trying to take on board all of these contradictory experiences was one of, again, ultimately being humbled because we've taken so many steps toward all of the police reforms that everybody talks about doing. Very successful in many regards. I failed in others, most notably in establishing a police force whose makeup fully resembled that of our community, which is about 25% Black. But across all of those, the truth is it didn't go close to deep enough to really deal with these sources of distrust that even had we perfectly implemented all of the policing policies that the most enlightened minds say you're supposed to do, clearly wouldn't have been enough because it doesn't alone deal with the economic disempowerment that people were speaking and the different experience of health that people were living. And we have to find a different way to come face to face with the experiences of others without pretending that we don't have a perspective shaped, in my case, for example, among other things, by being white.
So I'm looking at the sunshine on the porch there, Pete, and it's reminded me, Billy and Pete, that it's June and it's Pride. So happy Pride. But it's also, we just saw the news that our members of our trans family have just been obliterated from the White House's understanding of healthcare protection. And I'd be curious, like, how do you, what's happening for this moment for our community?
I am really tired of talking about it.
Okay.
I'm really tired of acting, and I don't mean this in any shady way. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. It's the same hate. It's the same oppression. It's the same. We've already done this. We've already been here. We've already done it. That is what needs to change in our government. What is going on? We need change for good. My ancestors fought for this. My grandmother fought for this. I fought for these rights. Are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? I'm sorry. I just can't talk about it anymore. And nobody should be surprised. Why are we talking as if we're surprised that this has happened? It happens all the time. It happens every day. It's what this country is built on. So when are we going to have that conversation? Change that for real so that we don't have to have this conversation ever again. It's ridiculous. Why are our rights, basic human rights as human beings, up for legislation all the time? It's normal, it's regular, it's what we've done for 400 years, it's what we've done. I don't understand the conversation. I don't understand why it's a conversation. It's human beings, period. I'm sorry. It's just this last couple of weeks, the back of my head, as you can see, the back of my head's about to blow off. It's like,
Yeah. No, I'm with you.
What is that? I don't understand it. I don't understand how we get to do that. And that's the process.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Look at the man at the Department of Health and Human Services who was putting this rule together. Said it's been a year, but he described it as basic housekeeping. Sweep away the healthcare rights of.
I mean, it's not just that, right? It's based on denying that transgender people exist. I mean, It's trying to write them out of existence at a societal level. And of course, at an individual level, that could mean a kind of institutional violence that deprives an individual of existence. I guess my way of trying to make sense of this is to remember that America has a long history of suppressing and destroying rights. And America has a long history of expanding rights. And have shown ourselves to be very much capable of going in either direction. And we want to believe it's a one-way street, that every generation will look back and see that rights have been expanded compared to the generation before. But it's not. It's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And this is when we're going to find out, right? We get to live through the moments that are going to reveal whether America truly can really not only wrestle with, but defeat these forces, or whether they're going to defeat us. This is the season when the 2020s will be the decade in which we find out.
Yeah.
And I think they're the decade in which we decide. So in many ways, it is on anyone who is active in America right now, anyone with a platform, anyone with their hands anywhere near the pulleys and levers of government power, to make decisions that will be remembered as either the beginning of the end or the beginning of a completely different and better chapter in American life. And it's hard to even talk about it without collapsing into cliches, without using platitudes, because the idea that equal dignity and respect belongs to everybody, it sounds like a platitude, and yet you have to say it out loud because it's clearly not reflected in the actions of our government, and it's clearly not understood in the hearts of our political process. And so here we go. And I guess the good news is we get to make history, but making history doesn't usually feel good at the time. That's the thing.
Well, I will say, Billy, that your fierce bravery gives me strength. So the back of your head blown up, but there's energy there. There's energy that we need, and I'm grateful.
Listen, I'm doing the best I can. I just have to be present. It's the only thing I know how to do.
So I just want to cut in and tell people we're going to go to questions fairly soon. And if you put your questions in the comment field of the Facebook Live feed for the BAS, we'll get those, and we'll bring them up. And I actually have a first question comes from somebody who wrote the past month of May marked the 175th anniversary of Southern Baptist Convention, 25th anniversary of their formal apology for their role in slavery and segregation. Their roots are born in one of the worst human tragedies in history, slavery. Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, two of the most powerful legislators in America, both belong to Southern Baptist churches. What role do you think Southern Baptist fathers have played in the current racism in America, and how can they lead to change in changing the immense human suffering they've been perpetuating?
You want to take this, or should I?
I think we want both of you on this one.
Well, I grew up in the Pentecostal church, okay? The Bible, as they say, the greatest story ever told, the Bible. Let's just talk about the Bible for a second. It's a book that's written by human beings, artists, if you will.
Yeah.
Over 2,000 years ago. Were they vessels Was God speaking to them? Yes. God speaks to all artists. That's the connection that we have. We have a connection to the divine as artists. So yes, it was written by man, and yes, they were speaking through God. It was 2,000 years ago, set up as a tool to teach people about or assist people in how to live their lives through moral and parable. Religion is man-made. Spirituality is divine. Religion has an agenda. That agenda is whatever the man who's in charge wants. And they use the Bible to weaponize the language in whatever the direction that they need. I call it cherry picking. So if you want to have slaves, you can find a passage in the Bible where it says, slaves obey your masters, and that's cool. If you want to start the Southern Baptist Church or the evangelical white people, you can find a chapter where, you know, people who aren't white are a third of humans, and that's why Black people are bad, and so that's why we hate Black people. The Bible told us to. Or if you are the cisgendered Black men who like to kill trans women, who hear from the pulpits of the churches they go to every Sunday, the Black church that they go to every Sunday, that it's okay for you to murder trans women. God hates them. The Bible is used to do that, to weaponize hate always. Every war that we've ever fought, every war that's ever existed on the planet is based on somebody's Bible. Whether it's the Torah, whether it's the, it's based on somebody's spiritual text. Stop it. Don't worry about my salvation. Let me worry about that. And let's get to work on, it's crazy. It's crazy. It's like you're in one side saying Jesus, 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 and then the other side, you're voting for Trump. Now your Jesus don't make no sense to me. I don't believe in that one. that Jesus that tells you that that's all right. Mm-hmm. That Trump is all right. I don't believe in the Jesus that tells anybody that Trump is all right.
I mean, there was something about the image of a president oppressing people in order to hold up a book in front of a church that is mostly about how we will be measured based on whether we made ourselves useful to the oppressed.
Right.
That called the question even more clearly than I've ever seen. And, queer people are in a very specific way familiar with the experience of being subjected to another person's interpretation of their own religion.
Right.
And at the same time, one of the graces that I found on the campaign trail was how many people were ready to hear a different conversation about what any religion might call us to. And of course, religion has been used to replicate the worst forms of oppression. And it has been used to help liberate from those. There's a lot of conversation now about a progressive Christianity. Much of this is not a new invention. You look no further than the traditions that led to the civil rights movement. And so this tension will exist because it exists in the human heart between what is convenient to believe and what makes us better. But the most important thing that I draw from my understanding of my faith is about an understanding that the world's not sliced up into people who are all good and all bad, and that the very worst things can be called out of each of us, and the best things too. And so much now is going to depend on whether we have the best or the worst called out of us. And we've got a president who is calling to the worst in us. We've got a lot of leaders who are calling to the worst in us, sometimes invoking faith as they go. And yet we also have a different call that we might hear, whether it is structured through religion or not. we can't keep going through life assuming that the world is made up of the good people and the bad people, and reassuring ourselves that we're among the good ones. After all, again, this is part of the obstacle to a lot of white progressives coming to terms with how we're implicated in systemic racism, because if it's something that only 100% bad people can be capable of, and of course I'm not a 100% bad person, then it follows that, well, I must not be capable of racism, when actually everybody is socialized into it in such a way that it is another one of those things that can be called out of any of us, and is on a daily basis, whether we see it or not. So, as has always been true, I think faith can offer a great deal right now, but we see it twisted on a daily basis in order to afflict the afflicted and comfort the comfortable.
Here's a question that we said: what do you think it is about this time that seems like the language of apocalypse, the language that this is the end of times, things are worse, there are terrible leaders, there is a great divide, and that this seems to have, are we in a different kind of time, or is this the same story?
I think we're here because we haven't been able to make this a different time, right? The very same demons that brought the country to the brink of destruction in the Civil War, white supremacy, leading the way, are the demons that have led us to this point. And so here and the question is, and again, art gives us all kinds of images. Sisyphus rolling the boulder to the top of the mountain only to have it come back down. The image, not to be flip, but one of the things that the creative world has given us that I think about is the sequence in Roadrunner cartoons and Looney Tunes when the coyote's gone off the cliff but hasn't looked down yet. And I think that's one of the greatest warnings. Yeah, we got to make sure that's not us, right? Already off the cliff, just haven't realized it yet. We've got to be bringing ourselves somewhere else. The question of whether this time is different is up to us. That's the thing. We're not academic observers of this. And look, these kinds of forces have been with us from the beginning. They've been with America from the beginning. They've threatened to tear America apart from the beginning. But we have battled them in so many ways from the beginning. And so the outcome of this chapter in our story, I think, is up to us. Let's not let it be the beginning of the end.
Pete, you're so eloquent. For real, you say it so well. You just say it so beautifully, like you should. I can't wait for you to be the president.
Amen. Well, I'll say yes to that too. Yes. So, Billy, here's a question that just came in. It said many of the Puerto Rican protests happened with dancing, music, and even opera. Where's the place for art today in U.S. protests?
I think there's always a place for art. I think if you're an artist, you just have to do it. I think we live in a generation, this sort of, it's been interesting to me to watch kids, the younger people, who grew up with social media with everything at their fingertip, the click at their fingertip, because it's like this question of, well, how? Well, how did you get that job, in Kinky Boots? I went to the audition. Like, it's really not, if you want to make art, make art. Like, just do it.
Yeah.
You can't wait for anybody to give you permission to practice your art. You should be doing that all the time, whenever you can, wherever you can, and however you can. That's what artists do, whether people are paying attention to you or not. And most of the time, they won't be paying any attention.
Right.
That's not what being an artist is about, though. You're an artist because there's a fire in your soul to be so.
All right. So I have another question about pride. And this is about the fact that since queer people of color were not always included in the early parts of the movement, what can the LGBTQ plus community do now for the Black Lives Matter movement?
Show up.
Show up.
Show up for us like we showed up for y'all. March with us like we marched for y'all. Raise money for us like we raised money for y'all. I said that the Broadway Cares, Equity Fights AIDS, and the Actors Fund. You know, I came into activism through the Broadway community. I learned, and ACT UP with Larry Kramer and that whole, that was my era of civil rights. And that's where I learned. It's about policy. It's about financing how you use the media, where financing and media intersect to create policy. So join us over here, create one body, and let's create some intersections so that we can change some policies for everybody.
And we can also
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say we can begin by acknowledging that leadership, that queer leaders of color paved the way for Pride as we know it. By the way, which was a response to police violence.
Correct.
And you look at Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, the contributions of so many who paved the way for us. And I'm conscious as a white cisgender gay man that I have in many ways very little in common with a Black trans woman standing up for her rights, but she was there for my rights and is there for my rights. I got to be there for hers. So I think in the queer community, as we think about the meaning of allyship, the fact that queer voices led and created a path, but also, for example, I'm wearing this wedding ring because a lot of people not at all like me, within and outside of the LGBTQ plus community, stood up for my rights. This is a very good time for us to, I think, learn and remind ourselves about the history that teaches what good allyship can look like so that all of us can be better allies.
So there's a follow-up question to that here, Pete, that we just got, and it's about, is there the risk that our white privilege, yours and mine, overwhelm our queerness? You clearly had some of that question, even from LGBTQ activists during the campaign. Obama had this question when he first was running, is he Black enough? And you certainly faced that question, are you queer enough?
Yeah, I think, look, to me, at the end of the day, being out is about being true to yourself. And I did not come out and find that way to be who I am in order to ever again have to look over my shoulder and ask if I was enough. But this is also a time to remember that each of us is on a different combination of sides of the different patterns of exclusion in our society. And I have always looked to find in my own experience and being on the good and bad sides of those patterns, a way to motivate or inform my solidarity with others who are not like me without trying or pretending to compare one struggle to another. And it's hard to do, and it can be clumsy when I try out loud to reason about how being part of one pattern of my identity might affect another one. But in the end, I think that the most important obligation for queer people as queer people, especially for those who are in the relative safety of being an educated, middle-class, white man who is also gay, is to make sure that you are that much more attentive to being there for people who don't carry those advantages. And not, since a complex of privilege isn't going to be waved away or dismantled in one season, use it to help. Don't use it for yourself, but use it to make yourself useful. And again, this will be an awkward process, but it is imperative that we find ways to do that. Because the greatest crime, I think, would be to pretend that these patterns don't exist.
Right. All right. So I have a question that came from someone It says both of you are great inspirations. What advice would you give to someone if you're talking to someone who has stances you find hateful and divisive, but you also believe to have an open heart and potential to learn? How much patience do you have?
I'll say this. I mean, again, not every struggle is different, but I think back sometimes to the struggle we experienced in Indiana when I actually, right around the time I was sorting out how to come out, was the time that Mike Pence famously made put my state on the map as one of the most visibly anti-LGBT in the country. And there was an amazing kind of conversion that happened for a lot of people who were, I think, thought of themselves as conservative because that's just what you were, where they came from. But they knew this wasn't right, this kind of discrimination that was happening. And they would be inching their way toward the right side of history. And I think often of a woman who was a little more conservative and older, and she tapped me on the elbow mischievously after having run into Chasten somewhere. And she said, "I met your friend and he was wonderful." And for her, saying that she saw us and understood, even though friend is not the word, it wasn't the time to put a finger in her face and tell her about the difference between a friend and a partner. She wanted to find her way to the right place, and I wanted to beckon her rather than drag her there. I don't know whether that applies in other contexts of what we have to overcome. I know that we always need to reach out to the humanity in one another. But I'm very mindful of the Black woman who was in a viral commentary recently talking about what was happening in her community, finished by saying that people should be thankful that she and her community are seeking equality rather than revenge. And so I don't think it's for any, I guess what I'm saying is if you are on the benefiting side of one of these patterns of exclusion, that's when the question of how patient people ought to be is not up to you. Yeah. And so this it's just not fair for this to have to move at the speed of when the least ready people are ready. I think what this activism and protest and outcry is doing is letting people know that the schedule for being ready is going to have to pick up.
Amen. Yes. Yeah. All right. Then we got the question for you, and I think it would be our last question from a 10-year-old boy named Zachary Eisenberg. He says, "I'm a 10-year-old boy from South Florida. I can't donate or vote, but I want to help. What's the best way for me and young people to get involved and make change?"
That's so sweet. That's really, really sweet. You know, when I was, what's the boy's name?
Zach.
Zach, when I was your age, Zach, I would just piggyback with my parents. I remember, voting day was always a day off from school because the schools were used as poll places very often. But I would have to get up every day. My mommy would get me up every voting day, and we would have breakfast as normal. And I would walk her to the polls to make sure that she got a chance to vote. So I would say, at the very least, take yourself down to the poll station and help some of the older people figure out how to vote. You know, these machines can be hard to work sometimes for the older people these days. So give them some help.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, thank you both. This has been an extraordinary conversation. I'm really grateful. We also want to thank the Knight Foundation, extraordinary supporter of the arts and makes this series possible. And we want to say happy Pride to people, and Black Lives Matter, Black trans lives matter, create change. Thank you all. Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Pete.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.